good afternoon, good evening, good night, good morning, depending on where you are. I think we have to say that now for Zoom. My name is Macarena Gomez-Fariz, or Maca. I'm the director of the Global South Center. The Global South Center at Pratt Institute is a space for experimental thinking, being, moving, doing. And we are really excited to co-host this event with the Critical and Visual Studies program, which is housed in Social Science and Cultural Studies at Pratt Institute. I'd like to especially welcome our Pratt students. There are 3 classes that are joining us tonight from different cohorts from across Social Science and Cultural Studies, and to thank Professors Jamil, Valiavarchka, and Bradley and their classes for joining us tonight, as well as all of our friends and colleagues interested in this important work. This is our first event in this series, and I'd really like to give Bradley, co-director of the Global South Center, professor in social science at Pratt, for organizing this event. I'd also like to thank and introduce Professor Zat Jamil, who's an assistant professor of Global South Studies, and assistant professor of Visual and Critical Studies, Wendy Muniz. Both are from the Social Media Lab at Global South Center, and Professor Jana Brown of Performance and Media Studies. Jana, Zat, and Wendy joined Cisco, and also I want to acknowledge that Jifka and Mae are very key components of this, but Jana, Zat, and Wendy joined Cisco this year as new co-directors of the Global South Center. So congratulations and welcome as co-directors. You'll be seeing new programming from us and new strategic priorities that we'll talk to you about soon. If you're interested in the Global South Center, and you do want to be interested in it, please email Cisco Bradley to sign up for our upcoming events and promotional materials. We have a dynamite series that follows this kickoff event tonight that includes talks by Nicole Fleetwood on the prison industrial complex and those questions. Julie Meretu, the wonderful Ethiopian American artist who paints on settler colonialism and architecture, and a number of other discussions. So we have 4 or 5 events this semester, and you can see those right below. Dora Santana on Black trans women, and next semester we'll celebrate books by Jifka and Jana. So it's a very exciting year for the Global South Center, despite the fact that we're in a period of austerity. And Pratt Institute still supports us, but I have to say, we're doing this out of the love and passion of this project, intellectual and cultural project, rather say than any capitalist venture, as you all know. So I'd like to let you know, and this comes from our social media lab, messaging that we're recording tonight's event, and we're doing that in order to archive it as part of our ongoing lecture series. Tonight, it's an honor and my distinct honor to celebrate the director of the Critical and Visual Studies program, an incredible intellectual and author, Mae Joseph. Mae is professor of social science and cultural studies at Pratt Institute, and she teaches a walking history of coastal New York, which is very difficult to do via Zoom, but she's been somehow able to translate that course into also a Zoom course. She's also the founder of the Harmattan Theater and has produced a number of site-specific performances along Dutch and Portuguese maritime routes. Joseph's other books include The Ghosts of Lumbumba, which she has, I think, published with the Poetics Lab in Ira Livingston, who is in the house, 2019, just right after, shortly before this publication. So it's really shows to the prolific and transdisciplinary dimensions that Mae brings to the table with her. She's also author of the beloved book, Fluid New York, Cosmopolitanism, Urbanism, and the Green Imagination. I think a book ahead of its time and finding new audiences all the time with students and those of us who are thinking about cities and their futures. That was 2013. And the Off-Sided Nomadic Identities, the Performance of Citizenship in 1999. The book we celebrate tonight is called Sea Log, And it's quite a feat, and we've already been getting feedback from students and from our professors who've been teaching pieces of it, and I look forward to hearing an enlivened discussion and engagement on the book. Sea Log describes how the ocean has always been a harbinger of strangers to new shores. Migrations by sea have transformed our modern conceptions of mobility and belonging, and they've disrupted notions of how to write about movement, memory, and displaced histories. Sea Log really is a memory theater of repressive hauntings based on urban artifacts across a maritime archive of Dutch and Portuguese colonial pillage. Colonial incursions from the sea and the postcolonial aftershocks of these violent sea-like, largely forgotten for most formerly colonized coastal communities around the world. So what Mae is up to here is to instantiate or put on display this navigational history of post-colonial coastal displacements, and she excavates a number of different sites, including Dutch, Portuguese, Arab, Asian, and African influences along the Malabar Coast. This is a long coast and many historical influences. This is a lot of work to think about coloniality and its afterlives here, and she does it beautifully. Joseph also unearths the undertow of colonial ruins in a project that addresses the history of transnationalism from a maritime and fluid perspective. So that's a little bit about the book, and it's a great honor to have Dr. Sudipta Sen with us here to be in conversation with me tonight. Dr. Sen, Professor Sen, is Professor of History and Director of the Middle East South Asian Studies Program at the University of California, Davis. And I imagine you have a bit of an orange sky there with all the fires.
It's still the zombie apocalypse.
Yes, yes. We're so many dimensions of this unfolding apocalypse, right? That goes back to some of the periodization that I think Mae is also looking at, and your work also looks at. So Sen's work has largely focused on the early history of British expansion in India, and he's author of Empire of Free Trade, the English East Indian Company, and the Making of the Colonial Marketplace, and that came out in 1998. And also the book, Distant Sovereignty, National Imperialism, and the Origins of British India in 2002. His latest book is Ganges, the Many Paths of an Indian River, 2018, and that was also published as Ganga, the Many Paths of a River, Penguin Random House 2019. In it, Dr. Sen explores the idea of a cosmic, universal river at the interstices of myth, historical geography, and ecology. So thank you for being here with us. We honor you, Mae Joseph, and congratulations on this book. You see a number of your fans around here, and we look forward to hearing from you. So Mae, I'll leave it to you, and then we'll hear a conversation, and then hopefully allow the students first to ask their questions and comment and enter, and then we'll continue to see where we're at after about an hour and 20 minutes, okay? So welcome, Mae, go ahead.
Thanks, Maka, and wow, thank you for that incredible introduction, Maka, and thank you, all of you friends and family and students and friends from the past and stranger friends for all joining me in this first book party I've ever had. I've never managed to have one, so this is a huge deal for me. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to celebrate this arrival of this book through the Global South Center, and I want to thank Maka, who's the director of the center, for making this happen, along with Francis Bradley and my wonderful colleagues at the Global South. And I also want to thank Professor Sudipta Sen for agreeing to introduce my book, because my book is about the ocean, specifically the Indian Ocean, which is, you know, a book that took 10 years to write. And Sudipta Sen's book is a book that's extraordinary. It's on the Ganges River. And I have always wanted to have this conversation with Professor Sen to ask the question, you know, how do we think of writing between oceans and rivers? Like, what is that conversation, particularly in the context of South Asia? Which was a specific locale, but we could ask this question anywhere else. But Professor Sen's extraordinary book on the Ganges, raises this question. So I just wanted to have this incredible forum through which to think through the question that Macarena, when she joined Pratt, she came with a question of what is a decolonial practice? And I have to say that, when one writes books, one is always influenced by people one is around. And my book changed when I met Maka, because Maka asked some questions on the issue of decolonial praxis that I had always been working on in my book, but I hadn't quite theorized it in that way. And because Maka brings the Latin American critical thinking to my own post-colonial, post-national training, I was able to open up a whole sphere of thinking, realizing, oh my God, it's such a lost opportunity in South Asia that we've never considered the Portuguese and Dutch histories of our past, because when the British took over, they wiped out all references to the past prior to them in terms of colonial patrimony. And for that reason, certainly in the context of South Asia, we have not asked deeper and more troubling questions and made connectivities across the global hemispheres towards Latin America, which shared this history of Portuguese Dutch colonizations and the Spanish. And they were still asking questions around the idea of a decolonial methodology, sort of saying, we're not post-colonial, we're not past the colonial period. What are the questions that are pressing for us now? And it was this question that I think really made me, I've been writing this book for 10 years, and I was rejected by over 10 presses, just to give you all inspiration. Never give up in trying to find a press. But it was really in this last year of finishing the book when I met Maka that I was able to rethink it in terms of a decolonial methodology, which I realized is what I was doing. I didn't have a language for that. And the Latin American theorists were able to offer me tools to come back to the Indian Ocean. And when I say Indian Ocean, and there's a lot of people here who are not, who are not necessarily specialists. So I come from Africa, I'm from Tanzania, then I lived in India for a while, I grew up in the Middle East, and now I live in the US. I'm multiply migrated. And therefore, my cultural milieu is multiple oceanic knowledges. And it was this challenge of saying, how do I graft a history of South Asian, Indian Ocean methodologies onto the map of New York? Like, how do I make sense of the past, my past, because I live now in the US? And what I didn't realize was that the history of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was the history of New York. And it was a very simple connection for me between New York and Cape Town and Cochin, was that it was the same colonial administrators and the same colonial machines and the same apparatus that hailed all of us. But it was these different post-national histories in the contemporary moment that has made us lost sight of the connectivities. So this book was an effort to draw the historic past and its ecological derangements, as Ghosh would say, into a conversation with the climatic challenges and the language of a planetarity that we're all struggling with to articulate, particularly in the context of oceans and rivers and the sea. So this is why I wanted to be able to engage with Professor Sen, whom I will hand off the forum to, and allow Sudipta to expound on. But that is where this book came from, is this effort to offer a comparative knowledges of the multiple oceans and their multiple historicities through which many of us have forged our own livelihoods. And the question of what is a life? Who are these peoples, of which many of us are part of those peoples, that come from the global peripheries in sort of whose centers you could ask those questions. But that's where I will leave it for now. And I would like to invite Professor Sen, whose extraordinary book on the Ganges really inspired me to realize that it is that kind of deep work on a river that that links the histories of the colonial past to the impending climate futures that we are constantly being assaulted with now. So I hand over to Professor Sen, and I thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I will not try to summarize the book, which is at all. It would be futile at this stage. But I think you've already provided, and people have been reading the chapters, so I take it that you know something about the book. What I wanted to offer was a set of reflections and sort of some of the teasing out some of the ideas that Mae has already put forth, and think through with you different ways in which a historian might learn a thing or two from people who are not historians. So, this is for me a very important way of trying to inhabit or step into the shoes of other ways, the past can be remembered, felt, listened to, a different kind of a sensorium of the past, which we historians who are so, myopically focused on archives and records often forget. So with that sort of caveat, let me start with a small line from the poet W.B. Yeats, where he says something like the murderous innocence of the sea. And the murderous innocence of the sea is such that, the sea is wonderful. It can bring wonderful things to you. It can bring spices so you survive. It can bring coral and cornelian and porcelain from China, but it can also bring, people who come and take your land, and people who come and make you into unwilling subjects of a production process, haciendas and, of minas, of mines, things like that. So the lot of the history of the world has been enacted through the ocean. And I think that what Mae has offered us wonderfully here is kind of reading against the currents of those kinds of histories. And I think that there is a very interesting way, what I would like to call sort of mutual anonymity of histories, or different parts of the oceanic histories of the world cannot fully recognize each other, but they are connected. And that mutual connectivity and also, disconnect is part of our history, our historical experience. So I'll start with that. And I'm going to say just a few things about, the idea that there's something much deeper. I mean, we are now beginning to think about the liminal area between the human and the non-human. And, if you think about water and how water plays into human history, especially the oceanic water, brackish waters and salt, you can see that it's a deeply visceral, and even maybe, biologists can tell you that, we hear our mother's heartbeat for the first time, which is before memory, through the amniotic sac, which has recreated seawater. Pretty much. So, that's just a thing, and it's tied to creation myths and other things. So that's a different conversation someday. But I'm thinking about the time in which history arrived in a ship for people who had not seen ships before. Let's imagine that moment. So, let's say in the Sandwich Islands, Captain Cook shows up, and then it's part of the story of the Hawaiian peoples and King Kamehameha that, someday, the gods are going to arrive, and they may not look like gods, but, but maybe they are. And what happens is that, there's a kind of double myth that is created, right? These people for the first time see a ship, and they're brought into, in some ways, very unfortunately, also for Captain Cook, who then is, consumed in a ritual, and but, through that ritual of Captain Cook's killing, in his death, and possibly the fact that he was eaten, brings these people into the pages of history. And similarly, Europeans also have their own myth about, what it means for history to arrive in a ship. So this is the kind of undercurrent that runs at the base of all forms of global capital. And, today, all of you used at least 2 products from the Indian Ocean, which one was brought a little earlier in the, probably sometime in the, Middle Ages, and of course it became a part of everyday wear in the 18th century, early 19th century. One is the dye indigo, which is pressed from Indian blue, which is the fiber of the indigo plant, came from indigo plantations in India, and that was the dye that were extracted, the cakes of indigo, were then applied to cloth from Flanders, canvas, and then the manufacture of this cloth was in a place in France called the Nîmes, N-I-M-E-S, right? And the fabrique de Nîmes, and the Pratt people should know this, fabrique de Nîmes is this origin of denim today. So I'm imagining, although I cannot see what you're wearing in your torso, under your torso, but maybe some of you are wearing that denim. The other product that came, that I'm sure most of you use today, is the Indian fragrance called champu, which was brought by Dean Muhammad, who was a maverick salesman who came from Eastern India, my neck of the woods, and set up shop in Ireland and then England, and renaming it and marketing it as shampoo, which was in the 18th century. So there are these. So some of these stories are apparent, some of these are not. I think of Napoleon soldiers dying in the snow during the operation, in Russia, and the denim that they're wearing is actually both from the Low Countries and from Bengal. So these are the things that are part of the visceral and visual history of Mae's book. And again, I said that I'm riffing in a way because reading her book made me think of these connections in a way that I hadn't. I mean, sometimes I've taught these over the years, but hadn't thought about them in this way in a long time. The ship itself as an object of history, Commodore Wilkes, who was basically exploring what later became U.S. Samoa in the 1830s, came across in the forest, natives gathering together to worship a structure which by the Papalagi. It's called the Papalagi ship. Basically, the people found European ships so awesome and powerful and frightening that they actually would create the replica of a ship through, in the forest, through branches and trees and a kind of as a ceremonial object. And of course, this amused the Americans to no end. But I mean, I can imagine that it might be amusing to the outsider, but imagine the kind of historical weight that carried by Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. Those ships were not just ships. Those were sort of tightly packed capsules of historical change. That would transform the world as we know it, create the various Souths that we are part of. So that is sort of my sort of vignettes, adding them to Mae's vignettes in this wonderful book. It is a story in many ways of different kinds of colonialisms, and the different kinds of histories of Europe. It is a history of Europe that is created by or written or unwritten by and experienced by the people without history, in a way. So there are many Europes out there. For some people, Europeans appear in the guise of Portuguese. Some people, Europeans, appear in the guise of the Dutch and the VOC. Some, in my neck of the woods and in southern India, or in the east coast of Africa, or in the Cape in South Africa, history arrives in the guise of the Dutch, but also of the East India Company, and of people who monopolized gunpowder, which is another oceanic commodity. Nitrates, sodium and potassium nitrate, which can be only found in tropical and moist soils, which leaches the action of urea. So that gives you, a certain sense of the scope and an implication of the kind of argument that Mae is trying to offer here. Now, the Portuguese are very important in a different way. It is the Portuguese, from the Oporto and Lisbon, who managed to do something which is, most of history happens along the currents of the natural forces, right? I mean, the trade winds are the winds that brought traders, right? So the word mawsum in Arabic, mawsum, is the root of the word monsoon. Are the wet winds that come and bring the dhows from, and one part of the year from the, west coast of India to the coast of East Africa and then back again, or the Chinese junks from on the other side of the Indian Ocean. And the Portuguese, and it was very difficult for anybody to sail around the horse latitudes. And the Portuguese did that. They did that by lateen-rigged caravels, right? Where they figured out how to tack against the wind. Those of you who have sailed, you would know that you can actually sort of tack against the wind. So the Portuguese managed to sail against the currents of human history, if you think of it that way. And by, imposing their cartazas and making the ocean a backyard, they created what the British called, mare clausum, the monopoly of the ocean, which the British wanted to open up. And there were all sorts of fights, and these are the fights between the Europeans, the French, and the Dutch. And before that, the Portuguese are some of the bloodiest oceanic fights in the history of global conflict. So, so thinking through that history, again, gives, when Mae talks about, Dar es Salaam, when she talks about, Cochin, when she talks about the Caribbean, when she talks about these different waters of the different parts of the Indian Ocean. And here, as a historian of the river, I can just say that Mae, your ocean becomes the part of a global labyrinth of connections through the deltas and the estuaries into freshwater. If you think of the oceans not as a bounded sort of spatial totality, but actually as also watery networks, it changes our conception of the land as well. And I think most histories are amphibian, and I think we are amphibian too. I'm certainly amphibian growing up in the Delta. You are, I know, Mae, you are, and many of us are. On the Hudson, in the New York, you're also different kinds of amphibians. But this, but some of those histories, differently experienced, histories of suffering, displacement, untold histories, slips away from this larger history. It's important, because we don't want to squeeze all of this into one flow of time, one sense of temporal convergence, one sense of destiny. And, we live in a world in which this is more and more sort of hammered into us, that we are all bound towards the same, dystopian future. But I would like to say that, your book makes you think a little bit more about, different surface of a crystal. When you shine it in the light, different histories and different pasts emerge. Some of it is memory, some of it is history, some of it is just narratives. The Mexicans sometimes say that, the Pacific has no memories. It's an interesting way of thinking about it, but there are memories also of oceans, and the oceans both create and destroy memories in many ways. But a lot of this history slips away, and it's and need to be recaptured, reconnected. I think this is where I think your notion of the affect, which you start with, the affect of the saltine waters, the affect of the surf, and the affect of various people. I mean, millions and millions of people who were displaced against their will, separated, killed. I mean, the Middle Passage is also a story of oceans, as we know. As is, the stories of Potosi and the stories of, Pizarro and others who followed, and Cortez and the Sea of Cortez, of course, named after. There are so many oceans not named after these violent encounters, as it were. But I think that by invoking the idea of affect, you've put your finger on the idea of what are the conditions of knowledge. and the conditions of knowledge are, how much time do I have? I've talked about,
I think a couple more minutes would be great. And
I
then,
will wrap it up in 3
great,
minutes.
3 minutes is wonderful. And then we can move to the conversation between you and Mae.
Absolutely.
The question.
And so I think that's where, I think it comes together for me when, Mae talks about standing on the shore of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania and, looking across the waters, and her father says India is over there, across the water. And then, on the other side, people are saying, our East Africans are over there. And this is, that actually to me is the echo, which, doesn't necessarily reach or return, is part of this, the mutual intelligibility and unintelligibility of histories. And it actually, brings back into conversation, things like the history of Fado, or the Portuguese lament, which becomes the Madrugada, and the Mornas of Capo Verde, like the different ways in which the sea is sung. Mar Azul. I'm thinking of the wonderful, this everybody knows this, of Cesario Evора's famous Blue Ocean, which has separated people, but also created different possibilities of relocated people. So there is both hope and despair in your book, Mae, and but maybe, I think that I'll pause on that. I hope I have not been too scattered, but want to start with commodities and things and affect, and then move on to connections and colonialisms, different colonialism, and end with the idea of affect, as you've done in your book. I'm following your footsteps.
Wonderful. That is so helpful. Mae, if you don't mind, maybe responding a bit, and then also taking up the question that I think is implicit in some of these wonderful comments about what it means to do this kind of work when you shift from land and you're actually in a space of the liquid histories, and you're thinking about overlapping in multiple colonialities, as it were. If you could talk about what it means to actually do that work through something like the device, I think, the kind of writerly device that you've given us of the log, right? And what it means to actually allow for overlapping periodizations and spaces that really shifts area studies, which we know is so landlocked often, and begins to actually have these interlocking moments and histories and contexts in the ways in which I think you both are pointing to. And that, I think, is in line with some of this kind of new critical work that's really pushing us, right, towards a different planetary vision, precisely as you said, Mae, when you opened, that has an ecological impetus that really is about this moment. And I think this is so important for us as students, and I mean as professor students, right, thinkers, makers, how we actually think critically about this in the ways that you're kind of showing us an innovative methodology. So Mae, if you can respond to either Professor Sen or my comments, thank you.
Yes, and thank you both, Sudipta, for that gorgeous, expansive networking of what the book it's what I was trying to do in the book, and Marco for that really brilliant question. And I want to start with a very simple anecdote. So when I was young, my uncle, who was a priest, used to tell us this myth. We don't know if it's a myth, but he was a Catholic priest, so they don't commit sins, they don't tell lies, that our great-great-great-grandmother was a concubine from Indonesia. It was secret, it was a shameful thing, no one else talks about it, but he said that to me because I was from America and was visiting, that she was a kept woman. This was said in private, and my uncle passed away, but it was just a weird story that just was in the myth of all the rumors and myths that one grows up with. And I was doing work in the Dutch archives in The Hague, and I came across the accounts of 2 ships that came, Dutch ships from Batavia, that stopped in Koilan with comfort women. And they unloaded them and they loaded new ones to head off to Cape Town. And I found this 1627. And then suddenly all of this incredible myths that it's rumors. In the coasts of any country is filled with myths and rumors because change is always coming. And so the book starts with a simple myth, that an anecdote, a rumor, through which my archival work sort of unwound over the many years. And it led to the ecological question: what does it mean to write about oceans? What does it mean to ask questions that are mental ecologies? When you look out at the ocean from where you're standing, what is it that you see? What are the things that are lost at sea? And people like Christina Sharp and Saidia Hartman and Fred Moten have written extensively, along with Edouard Glissant, elaborately, Marlene Lubez-Philipp. There's extraordinary work coming out of the Black critical oceanic thinking on what this means in terms of a multi-species ethnography. But really it's a challenge to sort of say, how can we, from my particular locality, from my particular historical complexity, how can I enter the density of what lies under the sea? And this is a question Macarena actually asks in her book, Extractive Zone, is that right, the name of the book? But you asked that question, and I think it's the materiality of the ocean, both in terms of feminist practice. What does it mean to write about the sea? What does it mean to write about the ocean? And what are the mental ecologies that come out when you ask that question, depending on where you ask? Because one of the things I say in my book is, I stand on my mother's balcony in Quailon, and I'm looking out, and what do I see? Because I see the Portuguese forts to which my great grandmother would have come from, but we don't know that because there's no facts. It's only archives. So anyway, I'm not answering your question entirely, Maka, but I think that's such a deep question. I think this book was an effort for me to get to the question of what does it mean to write a more than human history of the ocean? What does it mean to think of multi-species ecologies? What does it mean to ask about multi-directional memories? And what does it mean to ask the question, what is decolonial methodology? What are, the Latin American theorists proposing, when they say that? What does it look like? And so for me, that looked like a combination of nonfiction, memoir writing, poetry, all of that pulled together with archive work and ethnographic writing, everything together produced this book so that no one would pick it up to publish it because it didn't fit into a discipline. But anyway, so it's a great question you asked. I don't have the answer, but I would say that my journey into asking that question of what does it mean to write about the sea, which Glissant, of course, asked that question so beautifully. And Marlene Lubez-Philipp in her book Song, but also She Tries Her Tongue. She really shows what it means to ask that question through narrative form. So I will just leave it there to say it's a great question. The answers are multiple, and it's a very challenging place to dive into. But the materiality of the ocean, I think, which is what Sudipta is talking about, is one way into this answer that you're asking me to think about. Thank you.
Wonderful. Did you want to jump in there at all, Sudipta? If I may?
No, I'm just trying to learn different things and things that I often it's part of the framework in which history is written, but often we don't have the or we are sometimes you have to learn how to unread things or unravel things in your discipline. And I think that this is a good place for historians, for like myself, to rethink about what are we doing in the first place, whose histories are these and for what, and what are planetary histories supposed to be. There's a certain kind of universalism in planet, which is very important. It's part of the politics of the planet, but it also is sometimes those kinds of planetary histories are also erase other ways of thinking about time and duration. I'm very interested in the question of, and it's there in Mae's book, like different kinds of time reckoning through the ocean is there. There are different temporalities, marine temporalities, we can call them, at play, and which is part of the histories of different kinds of people. But I was just going to add one more thing that, there's another way of, there's another word for the ocean in parts of British India called the Kala Pani, or the dark waters, the black waters, and which basically they would call the Indian Ocean became the black or dark waters because it meant, soldiers being taken away for wars and never coming back, or convicts being taken to islands in the 18th century, both in Australia, Prince of Wales Island, Australia, New South Wales, and also Prince of Wales Island, which was Penang, one of the first penal colonies, which I've been writing on for a different project. And so I've been writing a little bit on the dark waters, and also for Muslims who felt that, if you step into a ship, you won't be able to keep your dietary practices, which was true sometimes. Hindus who felt that they could not keep their quote unquote caste, and one of these things, these kinds of sentiments grew into the mutiny later in India in the 19th century. So there are other ways in which, and of course the famous cellular jail in Port Blair, the great panopticon, the prison that was built by the British for the interrogation, torture, imprisonment of freedom fighters, from India. And so those are other ways of thinking about the ocean that are punitive and forbidding. When Mae and I were talking about today's, I think many things came up. One of the things I've realized that in various parts of the African coast, there are different doors of no return tied to different histories of slavery. And so there are those memories or traces of memory, again, not always in the archives, that we invoke, we reach into to write the kinds of narratives that we do. And that's why, Glissant and Césaire and all these people are important to keep in mind, when we are, because, the writing is animated by that kind of an engagement. And that engagement needs to be not implicit, but explicit. I think you're helping me to, in some ways, it's almost therapy, we need to support each other to say why this is important for whom, and what does it mean to tell these stories right now? Because, again, the precarity and suffering of people in the age of the rise of oceans, the sixth extinction, and the planetary burning is not same. It's different. They're equally poignant and important. But so, and I think that, again, and this goes back to what Maka, you were saying about the way you were engaging with Mae's work, is that these are practices, methods, forms of political commitment, right? And teaching, in the way we teach these things, that we need to bring back to in front of people's view, and keep pushing and digging up the limits of the human and the non-human, and the shore and the ocean, the land and water, and people and objects. I mean, we need to keep digging and also representing in our work.
That's wonderful. Thank you. That really kind of encapsulates a lot. And I think the last maybe comment, and then we'll open up, for other questions and engagement, that I'd make is that, I mean, I think, Mae, one of the things that you're talking about, right, is how to enter in to a kind of colonial modern history and not reproduce the very kind of mechanisms or technologies of that history. So it's interesting that you call it sea log, where the log is the maritime technology and instrument, right, of the kind of global mapping in the kind of advance of empire. And your log is a kind of underlog, if you will, or counterlog.
Or counterlog, I was thinking that, because the log is written by the captain of the ship.
A counterlog, but it's also written by this author, right, Mae Joseph, who's really interested in intervening in some of those kind of histories of writing and mapping and documentation, as it were, and that kind of masculinist narrative. So the fact that you open with the kind of maternal line of the kind of, the history of the concubine great grandmother is really, really important as a way to provide a kind of feminist undercurrent to the story of the sea log. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say is that at the same time, you don't write out these histories, these maritime histories that have a masculinist bent or a technocratic bent. And I'm reminded of Beirut, right? And what happened in the port, this terrible explosion, precisely because, you know, I know Cisco's an expert in kind of shipping, and Jana Brown and, you know, others around our virtual room here on questions of diaspora shipping and trading, et cetera. But this very kind of Beirut explosion and the way it also opens up these kind of trade routes of mercenaries and abandoning states and you know, all these kind of fissures and frictions. And I've been reading about this recently and trying to understand some of the, like, what went wrong, right? And we can never understand, but I think your work is kind of showing us the kind of governance practices as well, and governmentality of the ocean as well. So you're not ignoring of power and commerce and capitalism and racial capitalism in all its roots. And I feel like that's a very accomplished thing to have done in Sea Log, and it would not be maybe your first book. I mean, I know Jifka has a comparative work that is her first book in comparison, and it's amazing to me to think about, wow, a first book that's already doing that work, right? That Wendy, others are writing these kinds of works. But I think that Mae, it's the fact that you actually take that authorial voice back and then try to weave through these methodologies and do all the things that I'm trying to describe, maybe imperfectly, is so impressive. So congratulations on that as well.
Thank you. That's a great way to put it.
So, okay, so let's open up. We've talked enough. I think the students and professors, I see Nick Gamso here, who's a former professor in SSCS, great. Martin, a new professor coming in to our department, and others, your colleagues from around. But also I'd like to give Pratt students who have actually done some close reading of the text an opportunity to jump in at this time. You might just put yourself in the chat in a queue. That's one way to do it. Professors, I also open it up to you. Is there anyone who'd like to open with questions or comments or anything of interest at this point for Mae or Sudipta? I see Jana Brown. Go ahead, Professor. Jana.
Yes. I'm just pushing all the little buttons in the Zoom. Well, thank you, Mae. I'm really looking forward to reading your book, and you know, 10 years of work, you know, and difficult work, because there isn't, because archives can be so landlocked as well. And so I'm really looking forward to this. And something occurred to me, it was more of a comment than a question, though I'm sure it points towards a question, is thinking about the history of plagues and diseases, you know, as we're in right now, you know, the flu, influenza, and its effect on indigenous in North America, syphilis in Europe, sort of being called the first modern disease, and, you know, the question of animal to human transmission, you know, so again, it's not really sort of a question, but thinking about oceans and the sort of the traverse of materials and people makes me think of histories of viruses and bacterias and amoebas and all sorts of delightful things for the humans. I guess the question would be maybe how to kind of balance the wondrous and the beautiful, the porcelain and the indigo, with this incredible violence and decimation. You know, I guess we're all struggling with that in all of our work. You know, how do we balance this idea that we consider people to be without history, and, you know, that history is arriving on their shores somehow, you know. How do we balance that in our studies? You know, because I know in the archives I can get incredibly depressed and mad and angry when I read, you know, and when I see the erasure of people and experiences in the ways that history is written. So folded into that is these big questions of the archive and how we read the archive and how we read against it. So I think that's about 5 different things. There's a comment and questions, all sorts of things. So do with it as you will.
I can have I'll give you a quick, I wish I had more time to talk about indigo, because the darker side of the indigo is that indigo planters forced young boys and men to work in the indigo vats, you know, up to their waist in the blue dye till it's a poison. So there are stories about people coughing blue blood and dying in the ages of 30 and 40, you know, or in the salt pans, you know, where they've harvested saltpeter, you know. So they're incredible cruelties, you know, that are not just instances, but vast groups of people subjected to cruelty of different kinds and for exploitation. This is the kind of work that Sidney Mintz did many, many decades ago on the famous book on sugar, Sweetness and Power, you know, of the how one commodity helped transform the Caribbean islands. You know, ended up, you know, the wiping out of the Caribs and the Arawaks and the recolonization of the Caribbeans through initially African, you know, laborers and slaves, and then of course later in the second wave of slavery from India in the 19th century, or indentured laborers. Similar stories in the rubber plantations. So that we know that history, and we know that it's connected to the oceans. But in a way, I think Mae is asking us to think about a different kind of poignancy, a different kind of narrative, a different kind of ways in which history persists, maybe, if I may use the word, different experiences that are very specific to women and young girls, maybe, you know, which are different. And so that is something, you know, people are now figuring out how Indian ayahs, the word for mothers, are basically wet nurses, and nurses were taken from India through the European colonial powers and sent all over the world, you know, white children who were brought up by expatriate Tamilian, Malayan, you know, mothers, surrogate mothers, you know, not before surrogacy today. I mean, I'm talking about the 18th, 19th centuries. And the people without any land, the people who died and lived in the ships, the Lascars from India, the Jack Tars, you know, who pretty much never saw land, only loaded and unloaded goods in different ports of the world, you know. So maybe one way to think about it, Jane, is to think about how we celebrate the history of cosmopolitanism sometimes, to be in multiple places and ports, but also there's another history of that, which is not so, you know, not so salubrious perhaps, and definitely diseased, you know, because germs traveled.
And it's a fabulous question, because along with this question, you know, deeper question I don't have an answer to, about pestilence and disease and contamination and infections that the sea roots were, you know, perpetuating and collecting and transferring, was also the collecting of plants and biotic specimens from all the colonies that the Dutch and Portuguese, they would come and get sick in India, and, you know, like Da Gama died of fever, malaria, and you know, all of them got their diseases in when they came to India and were infected. So in some ways they brought infections, but they also themselves got infected, but they took back with them much research on the antidotes to the infections. And this is where my friend Kavita Phillips, she's actually here, and her book is extraordinary. There's Kavita, and her book on the pharmacology and the colonial history of plant patenting of the colonizing countries is just fascinating work because it's, Jana, it's kind of the flip side of your question. It's like, what were the cures for all these diseases that these Europeans were constantly looking for? And in India, they found a huge biodiversity of sources, which till today, the French and the Germans still own patents to. And that was Kavita's work. So Kavita,
and Kavita's work also takes us further back into the idea of different kinds of piracies and different kinds of, just extraction and taking, where the, a lot of the, things that are now enshrined in law were actually made back then. But anyhow, Kavita has a whole series of interventions in many different ways. But I would love to.
So since Cisco and Kavita both piracy people, let's get them to talk a little bit. Maybe Cisco and then Kavita, because you're both like, your specialties are piracy and coastal populations. Cisco, you want to say something?
Thank you, Mae, and thank you, all of you. I guess there's so much that could be said. I think that it just speaks to the mobilities and the possibilities of the ocean, because especially kind of before, really up to the present in many ways. The oceans are fairly unregulated. What's possible to regulate there is not. I think we often think it's much more regulated than it is in some ways. So, right. I think that really stands out. And thinking of, I think that speaks to the mobility of what is possible, movement, and the limits of sort of law and jurisdiction and all of that. I suppose I could go on for a bit more, but I'd love to hear what Kavita has to say.
I have lots to say, but do you want to jump in first, Mae?
No, I think you should go. We'd love to hear you.
So this is so generative. Thank you, Sudipta and Mae, for this incredible conversation. So what I still haven't done, and that Mae, you point us to, is the Portuguese story, because the first pharmacology, or the first pharmacopoeia in Europe that was influenced by South Asian plant knowledge was by Garcia da Horta. He was a Portuguese, possibly a Portuguese Jewish scientist. Again, that's using the word science anachronistically. But his sister, it's supposed, was possibly burnt as a witch in the Portuguese Inquisition. So there's a lot of backstory of the oppression of Jewish scholars and possibly women who did science as, witches and so on. And so there's a whole backstory. I came across his story in my second year in grad school and wanted to do my whole dissertation on Daurta. But, the problem with South Asian studies at that point is we hadn't done enough of what Sudipta has now done. What Sudipta has done is cleared the way for all
that is so kind of you. I don't deserve that, but thank you.
No, really. It's so I think what this does is open up so much. But Mae, back to your book. I think what you do is you so skillfully traverse the coastline of many forms of writing without falling into some of the cliches of those writing. For instance, we already talked about how it's not a work of history, but it works with historical memory. But I was also thinking it's not a work of theory, but you engage with everybody from Fanon to Dépêche, from Glisson to Saidia Hartman. You don't elide many of these things that academic works which are more narrowly focused cannot engage with. You're able to be so inclusive about who you're having these conversations with. But third, and here's my question, it's not a political pamphlet, but you are engaging with politics, I think in ways that respond to Jana's question. How do you take on the very cruel and disturbing parts of this history? So first, of course, you talk about your ancestor who was possibly a concubine, but I want to talk about two moments I wonder if you would tell us more about. One is Mr. D in the Amsterdam shop who gives you this gift and he apologizes to you for what the Dutch did to your ancestor. And the second is the very end. Your places of pilgrimage on the Malabar Coast are Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and you're pushing back against a kind of Christianized Hindu 19th century formation by going back to a previous moment where many other things were possible. And I think of Sebastian Pranger's work, the historian who writes about the Malabar Coast. There's so many other things possible that get stymied by a kind of 19th century form, a modern form of a Christianized Hinduism, which then gives rise to what you push back on. So I wonder if you would talk about the politics. It's not a political pamphlet, but there's politics here.
Okay, so that part about Mr. D, it was in my diary, and I thought I can't bring this in, but I'm not going to edit what he said. If I put it in, I'm not going to say like more politically correct way what he said, So I put it the way I heard it, which is literally, his great grandfather was the head of the VOC in Hooghly, and he has paintings in his house of the 3 ships. So they are like the colonial machine, and he told me, anyone you see in Holland who's rich is rich from the 17th century pillage of India. So don't think there's the money here in Holland. We don't talk about money, and it's like everyone. But the truth is, it's all blood money. So he was very skeptical, and he was very honest in that sense. And he gave me a map of medieval Holland of the 10th century as this gift. And so I guess when, that moment was for me was like a South African moment of reconciliation when you face like the person who did something to you. It's this kind of moment of reconciliation across historical time. He's carrying the guilt of his family, and I was looking for my lost traces, not knowing what to look for. So I just thought it was an encounter that was startling. It was unexpected. It was in a map store, but it was appropriate. It was in a map store. But we are now in India in a period of great fascism, and this great, messy, tumultuous history of 3,000 years of pillage, colonization, trades, ecumenical, Buddhist, Hindu, Jain, Christian, Jewish, Mughal, all of these syncretisms are in complete danger of being edited out. And as a matter of fact, Sudipta has been on the forefront of that war, because his book on the Ganges is very irreverent to the history of this kind of Hindu India, because it acknowledges Muslims contributing to the great culture of India. So, but you're absolutely right. This is a very political book, but it is through the history of the coasts, because in India, the environmental histories that are available are histories of the forest. Because India is an agrarian country, and because during the colonial period of the British period, the coast was forbidden to Indians. You could not go to the coast because the British had salt laws. They did not want Indians using the salt, so they forbade Indians from going to the coast. So Indians suffered from, they had all these, these scurvy and all of these diseases, which is why Gandhi walks on the coast to break the British laws. So we have a history of forbidding on the coast. During the colonial period. In the post-colonial period, the coast was militarized, and it was only the untouchables and the low caste who lived by the coast. So what you're pointing out, Kavita, obviously is this kind of unspoken history of the caste and class divides that coast, even in New York City. It's the most vulnerable populations who live on the coast, on the Sheepshead Bays and the Far Rockaways. These are the most disempowered communities who have no social power, who Robert Moses put on the farthest away from Manhattan, so that they could keep all the poor out of sight. So it's interesting to say the racial, the racial mapping of who lives on the coast. I would just stop there, but it's a great question. But yes, it is a critique of the fascisms and the ethno-nationalisms that are being staged through coasts and landscapes today. You could say that about the U.S. as well. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mae. And just one more connection to Maka's point about Latin American politics. The Roman Catholic fishing villages on the coast, right outside Colum, where your mother lives, inspired by liberation theology, which comes from Latin American history.
Thank you for remarking on that. That was such a powerful moment, right? The 1970s, liberation theology was what fueled the notions, Latin American radicalisms, Paulo Freire, and that whole liberation theology, yes. Other questions? Lots of people here, Nick and students.
I'd like to make a comment or ask a question. Mae, it's interesting. You said that you spent 10 years writing this book, but when I read it, I had the sense that in your head you'd been writing this since 1974 or something, or it seemed like it was a very personal project. And I guess I'd be curious to just and I think your discussion of time and memory I thought was really fascinating, very revealing, and I think in so many ways it runs exactly counter to how I think of the past as a historian. So I felt like was what I learned, where I learned the most from the book, and ways of sort of thinking about time and space. So I think I'm sort of hopelessly chronological a lot of the times and fixed, sort of more fixed in space. So I found it really interesting in that way, and I think I learned a lot. I guess I'm curious, really, to ask, kind of if you felt like you had to sort of find some balance between the biographical and kind of how you, I guess, negotiated that with bringing in these much bigger global histories, because you do it really in a really fascinating way. So I'd be curious to hear about your process, and I thought maybe the students might benefit from hearing about that as well.
Thank you. We're trained in critical theory not to bring the self into writing. That's the purview of creative writing. But if you are trying to aspire to a theoretical form, you do not bring the self in. And I was reading a lot of Rousseau and a lot of Spinoza and a lot of Levinas, and they bring the self into their writing a lot. And I thought, well, why do white guys get to do this? And why is it that I cannot do this now? But all these guys are telling us about their malarias, their fevers, their relationships. And, these are very renowned scholars, and including Levi-Strauss, Tristropy. I mean, it is a Bible for me on how to write. You bring the self in. But as I said, why not allow their malarias, their fevers, and their traumas? But women from the global south or from the histories of the dispossessed, we have to be rational. We have to fight for sovereignty and citizenship. We have to be very cogent, coherent. We have to know our rights. We're not allowed to speak our traumas. There's no place for that historically right now. And that's why for someone like Spivak, and her early work was so rigorous, and a lot of us felt we had to be that way. And so it's a great question, Cisco. And I just felt like I was learning more from the Black feminists, the diasporic Black feminists, who've had a longer history of bringing in the self in careful ways, and and the way they've deployed that in different forms of writing, whether it's historical or poetic. And so it's a great question. I think for those of us who came from recently colonized place, there's been such pressure for women feminists to be very rigorous, and that we cannot do like Helen Sixou or Monique Wittig or, by Lucy Irigaray, where the self is brought in ways that is theoretical. And certainly in post-colonial feminisms, this has been much more frowned upon, because the baggage of the self is so cluttered with a kind of our fear of irrationality being relegated to the hysterical, has been so much there in the way we produce as colonial subjects. We always have to be rigorous. And so it was against that against that baggage that I was writing this book. And I wanted to bring out, certain kinds of hidden, maybe unwritable, like I would never think about writing my great-great-great-grandmother if it had not been my third book. Like this is the book that Ira Livingston officially gave me permission to write what I want, because I used to talk to Ira about my fears, and in a Catholic way, like, Ira, I want to write about the self. How do I do this? And he said, you've just got to write it. So in that sense, Cisco, it's a good question. And I think it's a question of theory. Julia Kristeva's work, Mater Stabat Mater. I mean, I've been looking at the French feminists because they use lyrical forms a lot more, and Black feminisms, across the world. They've used, so it's a great question. And I've struggled with the self a lot. And I'm not sure it necessarily works. But I thought if Rousseau and Levinas and Spinoza are using the self, I at least have in some, dead grand old man company, and that shouldn't be so bad.
I just wanted to add one quick note to what Cisco just said, and goes back to what Kavita had talked about, the forgotten histories of Portuguese pharmacopoeia. And that is that, there should be a distinction between colonial histories and histories of colonialism. Those are different things. And sometimes, history disciplines our thinking in a negative way. So I would say there are embedded chronopolitics at work in all our narratives. And I've been writing about that chronopolitics, embedded chronopolitics, some of you are not even aware of them, how we recapitulate or reproduce certain notions of historical duration, causality. We fall into the trap of grand narratives in a certain way. And I mean, I think that I just need to just give up for a while and become a student at Pratt, maybe, to learn from you guys.
Yes, you.
It's like the detox program. It's like, no, learn how to write in a way in which disrupts that flow, to write counter histories, or Foucault would call counter memories, and I think that, I think that, there's so much to talk about here, but I would really like to hear from the students. I think the students
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying so. And I think we have a very active kind of chat box going with Jana Brown asking some questions and follow up and dialoguing. But students, you are,
I'd like to certainly invite my students, if Aiden or Isabel are here, and students from the other symposium sections. I'd love to have you step forward. Don't feel intimidated, or please.
I have a question, if I may ask.
Bete, please go ahead.
Okay. So you were talking about the counter history and counter memories, and for me, when reading your book, there was a mention in the section when you talk about Hall of Remembrance and Rodney Leon's African burial ground, in which, right, she's trying to make a memorial for this violent history, and kind of the impact of it as both participating in it, and it made me think about more current times, what's happening today, and the Black Lives Matter movement, in which people out of anger and frustration are taking down these historical monuments of colonizers, and then in it leaving either a blank space, or what happened in London, replacing it with a statue of Black Lives Matter protesters. And in creating these memorials and monuments of these histories, and we have these two different stories of both the heroic and the colonized story that we hear, and then that of the struggle and the violence that occurred. What do we do with that tension that occurs? Do we create a statue in the same place of both having the colonizer and the slave and the violence at the same moment? Or should we, as theorists and artists, try to remove that tension?
Beatty, you screw me into a corner. You know how to ask the hardest questions. Great question. I mean, that's really tough. And let me just say that it's such a challenging place to think about visuality, right? We do critical visual studies, and there's no easy way around these questions. But the brilliance of Rodney Leon's African burial ground, the brilliance of it is that he deals with the impossibility of representation. I mean, he does, you know, what he says is you cannot capture genocide. You cannot capture this kind of enormity of a Holocaust. How do you represent it? And I think that's the success of the fact that Leon, you know, he in that particular form, the spiral and the hull of the ship, but the extraordinary porosity of the wind and the water and the openness, he doesn't try to reduce to a symbolic figure of any kind. He doesn't try to capture the Holocaust of over you know a millennia of an entire peoples. What he does is to raise and evoke the challenges of that in an ecumenical way. What's extraordinary is that when you walk in there, you're in the world, because it has all the symbols of all the religions of the world. African, just about, it's this extraordinary place because he's done so much research in creating, and he's, you know, the floor is the entire map of the global trade of slavery. So it's such a great question. You know, what do we do with the challenge of you know, racist monuments and monuments built in histories, and do we replace it with other kinds of monuments? And highly, it needs. I'm going to ask other people to respond because for me that you know, I came out of Tanzania, and we went through this in Tanzania, where all the streets were renamed. They were all colonial English streets. Then they were renamed to, you know, streets of different Africans, you know, who then became, you know, was soldiers or presidents or whatever. And then those streets got eventually shifted again when the next coup happened. So there's a kind of ephemerality to name changes that I come from, where I've, you know, so my relationship to shifting monuments has been very complex because I'm not clear how to approach this. It's a huge challenge. I mean, taking something down that's Confederate and racist is simple to me. Like, yes, take down colonizers. What do you want to put back in there? I think it's the Rod and Leon question that he asked through his monument. How do you represent something? And I think he does that well. Daniel Libeskind did that in the Berlin Monument of the Holocaust as well. But I think Leon and Libeskind are both examples of great ways to ask a question through a monument, as opposed to capturing something on a horse or on a, you know, some kind of literal thing. So I'm not answering you. I think it's a fantastic question. I think Leon responds to your query in a way that's really compelling, because he makes it so open. No one walks in there and is not transformed. No one walks through that monument and does not feel powerfully unstable, decentered. That's a successful monument.
I just want to add one tiny thing to that. You know, I mean, I've been going back to the late 18th century again, the site of my first crimes, and looking at you know, the Great Bengal Famine, which nobody knows, 5 million, 7 million. I mean, it's one. What kind of monument would one erect to the memory of those dead? You know, and I've been thinking about this because, you know, I'm looking at the hollowing out of power, and you know, this is my new project. And one of the things that I've been looking at is how the famine also created, and pestilence created, the first kind of the great hospitals in which the British surgeons could find all the cadavers they wanted. And because when the human body is completely denuded of adipose tissue during a famine, all the organs shine like the best specimens you can. I'm sorry, I'm being so morbid here, but this is what I've been finding in the archives. And I was just thinking about this kind of harvest of literally bodies, you know, is how does one thinking about that? I mean, today, you know, yeah, the Bengal famine is like a Wikipedia entry, you know, but if you think about, I'm just thinking about the kind of thing that Michel Roth-Trouillot asked us to think about, which is that silences and aporias and are part of history, and there are some silences are very powerful, and we need to capture the power of silence. And the capture of that. I mean, so that's another way to think about the wonderful question, that was just asked about, how does one, think of remembering, in that particular way. And so, sorry, it just went through my mind while you were talking, Mae. So a little bit of a stream of consciousness here from me, but.
Oh, great. I mean, so many different, this is the generative possibility of the work of the ocean as well, and the kind of research, stream that Mae brings us here. I'm just wondering, I see Anne has some comments there, and Cisco, so make sure to check the chat. I didn't want to leave any other students, but hey, thank you for your rich, deep engagement there. Wonderful. And you brought us right up to the present to show the kind of decolonial, destruction and the kind of dismantling towards imagining something else, right, beyond this colonial kind of matrix of power, as it were. So I just am trying to, I know that Nick had a question and was in the queue. So other students, feel free to write me privately or to put yourself in the chat, and we'll go with Nick next, okay? And then we'll kind of start to, maybe we'll go another 15 minutes and work to wrap up. So Nick, go ahead.
Thank you, Maka, and thank you, Mae, and everyone. It's so nice to hear from you, Mae, and to hear you talk about your work. I noticed that you acknowledged the passing of Mina Alexander in your book, who was also such a great writer and sort of theorist of the mix of brutality and beauty, which constitutes history and modernity and so on. And it made me wonder, knowing that you've written so much about performance and embodiment, to what extent performance and the drama of everyday life and certain embodied performances have inflected your thinking, writing this book or moving from your earlier works into this area.
That's so beautiful. My daughter Celine is here, by the way. I've never been ever, in a place where she's the same academic thing as me. And so I'm just really excited to see her face. She's also my biggest critic, so I'm really worried about what she's going to say after this. But I say that because she was my crew member in my theater company for the last 20 years, indentured servitude, But in other words, for me, theater, the theater is a performative praxis, and the embodying to my theater work has been a way to ask questions about the coast. So every single chapter in this book was a performance that transferred into theory. By engaging with the coast, by creating a performance at a site, I was able to understand deeper the sedimentations, the kind of stone and the sand and the coast and the people who are there and their histories and then through that came the writing. I'm trained in the theater, but I really realized that in America, theater is all entertainment, and that wouldn't work for me. And I needed to ask to a kind of a much more Indian environmental theater where you engage with people and non-human and multi-species landscapes. I wanted to do that kind of work. So I've been using performance as a strategy to ask questions about environments, coastal environments around the world. And through that, this book has emerged. This book actually reflects a lot of my thinking about coast. And I think one thing Sudipta said, he said, your book, you write about landscapes. And I realized, yes, I do performances in landscapes, and it's very much about engaging with that, with the Anthropocene, but in terms of, what constitutes that interface between land and water. And I'm very preoccupied with the questions that are coming out of that. And it has to do with the way in which colonizations work. In much of the countries in the world that were colonized, say that South Africa, where I created a performance in Cape of Good Hope, Africans and people of color were forbidden to go to the coast under apartheid. So for 500 years during apartheid, peoples of Africa, the indigenous population, were not allowed to the coast. So creating performance there, bringing people who had never been to the coast was for me an extraordinary act of engaging with the histories unlearning empire, rethinking, our own pedagogy and relationships to claiming environments, landscapes, and ontologies. So it's a great question. My theater work is more like it's a workshop for my writing and my theory and my thinking about how to write about oceans and what is climate doing to our world. And I think theater is a great tool for that. So it's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. And we do have a question from Aiden. I don't know, Aiden, if you wanted to jump in or give you a second.
Sure, I could read a question.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask about when you were crafting the prose style for this book. Obviously, there's a bunch of theoretical references, heavily steeped in geography, but all throughout that there are like canonical literary references, even film references that are peppered in. So when you were crafting the narrative, how did you strike the balance between those to, for everything to flow together?
Aiden, do you mean the way I combine like different references in my writing?
Yes.
Well, I'm very, I'm very influenced by creative writing. I like the techniques of creative writing very much. And it was so hard to come to what Michael Rothbard calls a multi-directional memory. I opened the book with talking about multi-directional memory and, what Maka has asked me to think about, which is a decolonial thinking. And for me, the question is, how do you begin to do this? Like, how do you get there? And the big inspiration for me, Aiden, if you haven't read it, is Marlene Nobesse-Phillips' book, She Tries Her Tongue, which is it's a collection of, it's a book of poems, and her other book is called Zong. And in both these books, Nobesse achieves like extraordinary historical depth through poetry. And I performed with her in like 30 years ago, so I was very influenced by her work. So I've always written like poetry in that way to get to something, and I take that strategy, just write free flowing, try not to be bogged down by what you have that sound very academic, and then see what you have and see what you can use. So it's a great question what you're asking, and it comes from, sometimes I write creatively and sometimes I write scholarly, and then I try to graft them like a montage into my book. So it doesn't work sometimes it works.
Wonderful. I mean, now the conversation's really rolling. I'm getting a lot of private messages. There's a lot happening in the chat. And so, I want to turn it over first to Erin, who has a question. And then from Erin, we'll go to Zat's comment. I know that Cisco, following that, wants to return us to the idea of piracy. And then we'll go to Min Nguyen, who has a question about sound. So lots of rich discussion and questioning. We'll start with Erin.
Thank you. That's such a funny planned out discussion we're about to have.
Yes.
Mae, this is a pretty open question if anyone else has any feelings or thoughts about this, but in line with what Beatty was talking about in class, we were discussing the portion of the book where you talk about New York and its history, particularly the portion where Black enslaved people were given land, were allocated land to be a border between the white or the Dutch people, I'm pretty sure, and the indigenous people.
Yes.
And we related that to, again, the current Black Lives Matter movement. And we were kind of asking how we can look back at that history, that experience, that lived history, and
absolutely
an analogy for like fostering solidarity between minorities in the current.
It's really great question, because there are land deeds. When the Dutch arrived here, when the Dutch colonized, a lot of the first group of people to arrive with the Dutch were Portuguese-speaking Dutch slaves from Angola. So in other words, white people didn't arrive here first. They arrived here with today's historically African-American subjects. By the time they were from African descent peoples who'd been stolen from Africa and had been living in Pernambuco or in St. Thomas before they were brought over to New York. So Your question is really great, because during the Dutch period, which is 1624 to 1667, the Dutch freed 11 Africans, and they allowed them to own land. And that land, they did it selfishly. It wasn't like they were kind. Because the Dutch city ended at Wall Street, and then the Lenape people still lived all the way in what we call today inward. So they were always attacking the Dutch. So they figured if they can give all this land to their freed Africans, that would be a good buffer. And the land they gave them, and there's title deeds to this, it's from Wall Street all the way to Spring Street, and from West Street all the way to Lafayette Street. So think about that. That's the biggest amount of real estate in Manhattan. The most expensive real estate in Manhattan belongs to, historically, free Black subjects who had owned that land under the Dutch. But when the British took over in 1667, they took away the rights of those individuals, saying you can hold on to your land, but your kids are being born into slavery, because under British law you're not free, and your kids are being born into slavery, and your lands will not be recognized. So the British took away the lands that were rightfully those Black freed subjects, and those title deeds are there, and the land deeds are there, and their kids are born into slavery. So it's a shocking story in New York of how the most important real estate from Spring Street to basically like Canal Street, West Street to Lafayette is historically Black land, and it was always called Little Africa. All the way till like 10 years ago, you could see a little plaque called Little Africa on Father Demos Square. There was a little plaque that said Little Africa on it, and they've taken out that plaque now. So great question. And I think someone should come forward with a claim to reclaim that, along with the fact that the auction block is today's Pearl Street and Wall. That was where historically the auction block of Black of historically Black slaves were kept. We have work to be done, yes, but as you know, it's prime real estate. And think, and the wars that would take that to be, so your question is just so powerful. And so much historical work to be done on that, but no one's going to ask uncomfortable questions. But historically, it's stolen land. It was taken away without rights. The land deeds belong to the individuals of people like D'Angelo. That's the name of one of the freed Black African individuals who owned land. The huge areas of tax farm, yeah.
So good. So just following up, thank you again, Erin, for jumping in, and you produced a lot of responses there in May. Zad, I think you're next, and then we'll go back to Cisco, who will bring us back to the question of piracy, and there are a couple more in the queue. So go ahead, Zad.
Thank you, Maka. Thank you, Mae and Sudipta, for the engaging conversation. And I also wanted to thank the students for bringing Mae's text into the contemporary moment, because I think there are so many convergences, and it certainly provokes us to think about what solidarities look like across multiple land spaces, logs, and so on. So my question actually has got to do with methods. I am like really obsessed with methods. I teach the methods course, partly also because it is a part of my training as an anthropologist. And I would really like to know, Mae, because your book, I think it's so beautifully written, and how perhaps maybe you could share with us like the practice itself. Like what does a decolonial methodology look like in practice, especially when you're like sort of looking at both landlocked records, but also you're looking at mobilities, and then you're walking through the space. And so what does it mean for you in terms of recording ethnographic data, in terms of like processing it? Where does the documentation begin and end? And how do you make sense of all these multiple sources, and what that process actually looks like for you, and how you make sense of it as you move from the methods to the writing itself? Thank you.
Oh boy, it's so beautiful. I would like to just keep all of that always in that state of questioning, because the answer is always going to be changing. I just want to acknowledge that this book was made, its final form. Thank you to Zat and Zhivka, who edited the work very closely, to Maka and Francis Bradley, who shared so much theory with me. So, these are people who are my interlocutors and really, really helped me shape my work in this way. Ira Livingston, who kept assuring me that I could write about things that I didn't think I could. So just an extraordinary company of people that brought this book this far. But methodology is so beautiful, what you're asking, because there are many ways to it, but I like Deleuze. I think it's Deleuze, or maybe it's Guattari, but the notion of assemblage. So for me, the writing is always an assemblage, the assemblage of immersion, very immersive assemblage. So I'm very influenced by Aldo Leopold and John Muir. And John Muir, there's a lot of now, like the fact that, his policies could have been a racist. There's like a whole rethinking of John Muir, but I am very influenced by his Muir Web and thinking in that way. And so I take an assemblage approach, which is, I create these performances everywhere because performances are messy. And then I get information out of that messiness. And then I walk everywhere. I smell, I drag my kid everywhere. We eat everywhere. We talk with people. So that's part of the methodology. I lose a lot, but I also then write when I'm there. Wherever it is, I'm writing where I'm there. And I use different apps. Like I use Ulysses, and I use the Day One app. I do different apps, different kinds of writing, because when I'm there, I'm only doing that. So I do that kind of multi-strategy of writing, not consciously, but it's because my brain, if I see Day One, I'll do a diary entry. If I say Ulysses, I'm writing like lyrical prose, like my brain switches off, like it turns on. So I try these different strategies for methodology. So just to say, it's a great question what you're saying. And then, I like what Ira does. He draws. And since I've met Ira, I started drawing as well on my iPad. So I'm trying to draw, and I think the next time I'll be thinking of drawing my own maps. I've been starting to do that, influenced by Ira's own book on on poetry and history. So your question is profoundly beautiful, and I think I love living with all of you because you're all deeply immersed in methodologies. And theater is a great methodology if you take it out into the world and let it live among people. And so I've used that utopian part of theater to always ask a question to strangers. So all my performances are normally people I find on the streets and subways, or juice sellers, or musicians I found on a street or a corner, or some of them are homeless people. And so, my daughter's always telling me, do not go and talk to that musician, Mom. No, you're not going to talk. When we're in subways and I see some amazing musicians, you'll be like, no, you're not going to start another conversation. But that's where I get all my actors. And they all come. So it's a great question. I think assemblage and, bricolage, like these are the techniques of methodology. So there's some anthropological ethnography. There's a lot of sort of Michael Jackson, a lot of Michael Taussig. He's my lodestone is Michael Taussig, where he writes poetry and ethnography. So anyway, you're asking an ethnographic question. I use a lot of this multi-layered, it's coming out of anthropological writing, obviously. But yeah, multisensorial, use that word. Saramantakis is amazing. So I like Saramantakis' work, right? So yeah.
I think this is exactly right, Mae. And I think for those of us who are students and the professors and the choices we've made, right, to maybe leave the monocultural research one university, and that does not necessarily contain us, and move into this multimodal kind of space that we're in art and design schools. And I know I'm, with present company exempted, right? I know other people's work are not necessarily, I'm not describing this work as monocultural, but I think that you're talking about the kind of innovation that's necessary to do excavation and to do this kind of genealogical thinking that's also about a multidisciplinary perspective. So thank you for that. This is great. So I have not forgotten you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a brief comment to kind of circle back to the earlier discussion of piracy. There was a chat conversation between Jana and Brown, Kavita, Philip, and me. I think Jana made the point of that the oceans really in many ways are ungovernable, and I used to teach a class at Pratt. I haven't done it in a few years, but kind of that talked a lot about how piracy is essentially the oceans really were a space of. I earlier was talking about mobility, but also like a space of resistance in that it somewhat evens out the playing field. You can't compare maybe a huge warship versus a local, like a smaller fishing craft or something, but it's possible to actually thwart, you know, in some cases, you know, bigger firepower, et cetera, you know, by, you know, with in these sort of local acts of resistance, and really that piracy in so many ways was an act of resistance to often to colonialism. I mean, if you think of the Portuguese coming to say, my original field was Southeast Asia, so you know, the Portuguese arriving and sort of taking over trade routes as if, you know, really displacing tons and tons of merchants who were doing that. So what did those people do? Many of them became sort of pirates, you know, really, you know, anti-imperialist kind of, you know, resistors. And then, of course, the Dutch came later and did it even more effectively and stirred up a lot of additional resistance. So anyway, there was also, I also want to mention, there was some mention of David Graeber's work. Unfortunately, very tragic, his recent passing, who was also working on piracy as anti-colonial movements and so forth. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to circle back and mention that. So.
Any comments or follow-up there?
Sudipta, comments on the piracy and?
I don't want to. Yeah, I mean, I have to curb my enthusiasm, you know. But I'll just say one very quick thing is, you know, there are multiple histories of resistance, and piracy is, as Kavita knows better than any of us here, is a mixed bag, right? I mean, who's opposing what for what purpose? Sometimes it's a trade union, sometimes it is violence, sometimes it is, you know, both ways. And I'm just going to say two things. First, going back to an earlier conversation, Mae, if you ever write a short play in the form of logs, sea logs, and I would love to perform in that. No props, a stage, you know, like come in. There's a wonderful shadow vignette in the Satyajit Ray movie for children, Gupi Gain Bagabain, where all of Indian history appears in shadow puppets.
Wow.
Peasants over time, and including the colonials with the hats. You know, and I was one long time ago a theater person in college, and loved to do something like, because I think that the log, I mean, I think that, you know, I think it was Marco who kept pointing this out, and I didn't catch it, you know, thank you. That this is a log, and what are you doing here? The form, you know, of all the things that you've talked about, it comes back to, you know, what if you were writing a log, you know? And then what would a pirate's log look like? You know, did pirates keep logs? Was there a master narrative? You know, with a black flag, you know? But no, going back to what Cisco said, one of the things that I'm writing about now are hulks. I don't know how many of you know about hulks. The British took political prisoners and just simply put them on the ocean in decaying ships without food or water. And so I'm not going to give away as a chapter my book on punishment. And so, you know, once in a while these people would die, you know, and the bodies were thrown overboard, and the bodies would wash up on the shores of Madras, which today is Chennai. These are the Palayakkars, the polygars of southern India, many of them. I mean, so there's another story to along with slaves and pirates and commodities, we also have convicts. Australia, you know, Penang, you know, Mauritius, Guyana. I mean, you know, so there's another body of floating people, you know, who, of course, Singapore, you know, another, you know, and these people then later, their blood and sweat mixed with the soil, and they created new cosmopolitan communities, you know. I got into a fight with someone in Singapore. I was taking one of the city tours, and the guy was saying, you know, oh, you know, how wonderful it was that, you know, Raffles put together all these people, and, you know, this beautiful island came up. And I was like, oh, but wasn't it and I was asked to leave, you know, and I think, but excuse me, wasn't it like a penal colony? but so these embedded histories, going back to what Cisco was saying, that piracy actually is less like it's a window. You know, I'm sure you know this, through which like radical and like through which you look at this history, and it's wonderful. I mean, it opens up various kinds of legalities and illegalities, and makes us think about, the ocean as a sea of possibilities. But anyway, I am only talking more because you asked me to. I've talked a lot, and hopefully I've made sense. But there's so much here. It's so rich, and the pastiche, and the assemblage, and the mise en scène in your work, is actually a very important method. Is intervention, right? In a way, right?
Right. You said method is an intervention?
Method itself can be an intervention, because
right.
takes us to the other side of theory. How do you do what you do?
I will say that as I've been doing this kind of work, there's a lot of excellent work on non-human epistemes, on more than human and post-human ontologies. And I was thinking, this is fascinating. It reminds me of what Stuart Hall said, in the 1980s. He said, "Now that I am centered, you are all descentered." And what he meant by that is the minute that the colonized started speaking, the postmodern era where there's no history and there's the end of history and that's the end of stories and all of that arrived. In other words, discrediting the space for those who had been colonized to create a place to speak from, because the Western Enlightenment subject had already reached a point of modernity. They did not need those stories anymore. And I feel that our history of ecological rethinking, the kind of work we want to embark on in the Global South, are pressing questions that I would say that's rubbing against very compelling and very interesting other methodologies where the human is being written out, because it's now the era of the post-human and the more than human. So it is interesting time to think about environmental methodologies, strategies, theoretical modes, and at what point do the minor histories of the Char people, the river islands, the coastal barrier islands of the Lakshadweep area. I mean, are these histories, is there a place for them? Or have we moved into the post-human era where we haven't started the history of the Global South at this point, but we've already moved on to more than human and multi-species. It's a bit of a challenge there, how to balance those different moves, but that's sort of what I'm grappling to understand with the workshop on the Anthropocene people who are talking in a certain way. And then, some of us doing work on decolonial methodology in the Global South, which is, very grounded in actual materialities. So
I'm very suspicious of many of these things, and this is the nature of coloniality, which is that we don't want to be doubly written out. We're written out of the human, and then we're written out of the non-human. And we meaning it's a small we, but I know that the history of insects and frogs are important, and the history of the master narratives are important. Where do we, so that's why I was thinking when I was writing my book on the Ganga, I was engaging with Eduard de Cohen's book, How Do Forests Think, in the Upper Amazon, and I was thinking. How do rivers think? I mean, the idea of the river itself is a very human idea.
Right.
So as is the ocean. Human, again, not, like the kind of the grand humanity of Ecce Homo, but, the way the small h, if I may. But I think that it's important that, in a way, the Anthropocene has I hope, creates a dissonance, and I hope creates cracks in the system, so through which light can come in, because I'm a little bit worried that we all agree on what to say, how to lament the end of the planet in a particular way, and talk about history and time and the end of time in some ways, Fukuyama kind of ways, and then end up again, silencing and disregarding certain kinds of things. And I think your book very much is, in some ways, although you don't say so necessarily, is against that. What you do is a juxtaposition of the different scalarity of different histories. So the small and the big, and the deeper and the more recent, by juxtaposing them, you create the necessary dissonance. I think through which some of us can learn something, and our own experiences are part of that. I mean, by the way, I find that in many of your works. I find that in Kavita's works too, and so that's the way we learn.
Yes, I love this. This is such a rich discussion, and also the ways in which, I feel literally that I'm over the East River in Jennifer Miller's loft right now. I feel like I'm becoming increasingly invisible and it's starting to rain here intensely in Brooklyn. I can barely hear you all at this point because of the protagonism of the rain over the East River. So it's all being, it's a huge metaphor here for Mae's wonderful work. And the walking tour I've done with Mae around the East River even, and its overflow during Hurricane Sandy. So all of these complex kind of methodologies. Wendy, I know you have a comment, and also from a student that you want to bring forward, so I want to give you the final kind of comment and word.
All right, I think I'll ask the question from the student first. I think her mic doesn't work, but she really wanted to reach out to Mae. And Mae, she was interested on the role, if you could expand a little bit more on the role that silence plays in your argument and in your practice. We read the last chapter to your book, so you don't talk about that much in that chapter. And then after you've said that, I can tell you, I just had a brief comment, because I know we're almost out of time.
On the role of silence in the work. I think this whole book is a breaking of silence. And by that, I mean the silence that has started the whole talk about, like the anecdote in the family, that you cannot talk about certain things because of shame. And writing a book is the breaking of a certain kind of silence. It's a taboo to mention a historical violence, to mention the material realities of living on the coast. I think breaking those silences. So very interesting, the question of silence. I don't have a good answer. It's a beautiful question. I think the way I've used silence is through use of montage, as in Eisenstein. I think October and Battleship Potemkin are my two writing tools. The way he's used images there, I play with that for my writing. So that, so you have poetry, then you have prose, then you have silence of a different kind of shift. So in that sense, to answer the question of use of silence, I would say I have used it as in the form of like short forms that structure the narrative of the text through these different shifts, and the shifts are the silence. But I really don't have a good answer, except that it's a beautiful question, because it's so central to how we all use silence, right, in different ways. But my performances use silence profoundly, because in the Buddhist tradition, you can never see the whole Buddha's face. You should always, if you go to Thailand, the Buddhas or sleeping Buddhas are so big, no human is allowed to see the entire form. You have to step back, but you can still only see the foot or only the head. That's how big the Buddha is. And for me, writing is like that. You don't see the whole, and for theater is like that. You don't ever see the whole, like, the Da Vincian sort of, the template, the whole thing to stage for the eye. The West Asian ideas, you never see the whole form. It's so big. And in that sense, I use silence to create that. Great question. Thank you.
Okay, great. Wendy, you had one final comment?
Yeah, just one very brief comment. Mae, it was such a pleasure to read your book. It's super sensorial and experiential. And there's been a lot of talk about death and loss in this event. And I wanted to say in my conversation with my student, and as I was reading your work, I think death and loss are so much more in your work than just lack, which is, I think, the part of it that I found to be most decolonial. So you mentioned Glissant and Glissant's non-histories, right? I thought about Michel Raftrujillo and him being in the Monasterio dos Jerónimos, right? And thinking about what the absence of knowledge already translated into meaning. So that, for me, absence in your work is like an excess of meaning, which I think that can be put to use in ways that decenter, a definition of absence that just takes us to aporias and, roadblocks. So I just wanted to thank you for that. I think that thinking about it from a methodological point of view and to put that into practice as we walk around everywhere or anywhere we are at, it's something that we can mimic, and that opens up the world to whole different stories and meanings, as that was saying in the comments, to emphasis on relationality, right? Multi-species relationality and indigenous cosmologies. So just to say that death and loss is not just lack in your work, and I really appreciated that. It's much more than that.
That's so beautiful, Wendy, because ever since I came to New York, I've been trying to figure out, I've been talking to Mark about this, how do we, think about a Lenape methodology in how I approach, my work, and, how do we do that in the absence of actual ongoing conversations, even though Lenape is very much alive and well. A thick description of what that might look like. And for me, walking has been the methodology I've arrived at. But the silence is the histories of the Lenape peoples. It's this settler colonial silence, right? And it's a deeply powerful silence. I just want to say that the way you said it is so great, that we are walking in absence. We are engaging methodologies of absence, and how do we do that? And for me, I think the walking has been a way to bring people to the coast and look at the shorelines and the swamps and the wetlands and the islands, and to ask questions about disappearance and absence, but also an ongoing tactile living methodologies. It's not about just the loss, but the engagement with the now. So yes, I think walking is one tool for me. That's a Lenape tool. That's how I think about it anyway. And I think that it has to do with the practices of silence. I think it's a beautiful way for us to end this session, perhaps. That, what is the role of silence in one's own life and one's own methodologies. But thank you for that. It's gorgeous. And thank you, everybody here. You guys have been just amazing, and what great thoughts. And this is so beautiful. Thank you, everyone. And thank you,
Mae. Thank you, Mae, you held our attention, Sudipta, Mae, for 2 hours straight on Zoom, which is very hard to do now. Thank you. Wonderful engagement from the students. Thank you all for being here. We look forward to engaging you again. And congratulations, Mae. So many congratulations on this beautiful book.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Sudipta, and all my friends. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.